Okay, this is the second video, the continuance of the first one regarding the cardiovascular and lymphatic systems. We were talking about how cardiac output equals stroke volume multiplied by heart rate. Let's discuss a bit what influences stroke volume and what influences heart rate. So basically, we'll start with stroke volume. I think it's easier to explain. The elasticity of the membrane of the heart. The more elastic that membrane is and the connective tissue, the more you can fill it with volumes of blood in this case. And also it generates tension that is released back, pushing the blood out of the heart when you want to eject it. Obviously, the size of the heart, of the ventricle specifically, influences SV because that is the potential of the amount of fluids, blood that you can have in the ventricle. So a bigger chamber, a bigger ventricle means more blood that you can fill in. In addition, more blood means that you are elevating the tension, stretching the heart more, and thus can enjoy more of that energy being given back as force to push out the blood. The amount of blood returning to the heart from the venous system, so venous return is a very big indicator and influencer of stroke volume. The more blood comes back from the venous system, the more you have in your left ventricle as a potential to be ejected outwards. We can talk about the contractility of the heart, so that would be the ability to shorten and produce power or force. The amount of time between beats. So obviously, if you're beating at 60 beats per minute or 180, 3 times as much, you have less time to produce a beat, and that's why relatively you're talking about less efficiency and more power. It gives you less time to fill the heart. Any obstruction in the way that will influence venous return or the cycle from the artery part of things obviously will affect SV. Viscosity. The less fluids you have in the blood, meaning the changes to hematocrit, the less blood tends to flow. Its friction is elevated, and it resists the idea of pushing it. So when viscosity goes up, SV goes down. That is the classical example of working out in hot conditions or in heat climates. And basically, if you are sweating and not returning water into the body, meaning you're dehydrating, water is taken always first from the plasma, elevating viscosity, lowering stroke volume, and elevating heart rate. That is why intensity of any exercise in heat conditions, if you are not balanced for water, is a lot more intense. Stroke volume depends on the efficiency of the heart to eject blood directly into the aorta, into the systemic circulation. So it is the mathematical outcome of EDV and diastolic volume, the amount of fluids, blood in this case, that you have in the left ventricle at the end of the diastole, minus ESV and systolic volume, the amount of blood that is left in the heart at the end of the systole. SV is never all the blood that was in the heart, in the ventricle. That means that ejection fraction, by definition, the term has the word fraction. That means that it's not a whole, it's not 100%. So ejection fraction is obviously an indicator of the efficiency of the heart and how much blood can you pump out of the full amount that was there. And the systolic volume, as we said, and it's measured in percentage. In normal state, SV governs heart rate. Stroke volume governs heart rate, meaning that you try and achieve the best stroke volume that you can and adjust heart rate. When intensity goes up, heart rate goes up, stroke volume is leveled off at about 40% of intensity. That means just a bit above warm-up, and even less if you're well trained. And heart rate governs the ability to elevate cardiac output. So stroke volume is maximized very early in exercise, and we depend on heart rate to do the rest when we're talking about elevating cardiac output. At some point, when heart rate is so high, there's not enough time to be efficient, and stroke volume will go down. Athletes, well-trained athletes, are actually able to sustain a growth in stroke volume up to maximal abilities, and that's exactly what makes a difference between them and a non-fit, non-trained person. What affects heart rate? A is stroke volume, as we talked about, but also the time to produce stroke volume. So heart rate is an indicator of the length of the cardiac cycle and is dependent on it. If you want to elevate heart rate, you have to shorten the cardiac cycle. If the cardiac cycle is lengthened, then heart rate naturally, because it's measured within 60 seconds, sorry, got confused there, is decreased. We know that cardiac output changes in a linear relationship to the need for oxygen. So as intensity grows, the need for oxygen grows linearly, and cardiac output increases linearly. We have a few conditions that we see that hypertrophy of the heart is not a good idea. And I would like to explain to you something. So I hope you can all see this rubber band. I'll bring it closer to the camera. Here you go. And obviously an office rubber band is elastic. So the main characteristic of anything elastic is that once it absorbs tension, that it is pulled, it immediately wants to go back to its natural state. The more elastic the band, the more it tends to go back to its natural state. But if I were to pull apart this rubber band too much, it would perceive the elastic range and lose its elastic characteristics, meaning that it would become plastic and it will lose its function. And the connective tissue of the heart uses this characteristic of elasticity to help us produce a heartbeat and produce stroke volume. So anything that will change the elastic abilities, either extent or completely lose elasticity of the heart, of the connective tissues and of the heart, will decrease stroke volume. In addition, if you take the heart, and right now the band here will represent the ventricle. The bigger the distance from the membrane to the middle, the harder it is to push the blood in the middle, because it's easy to squeeze blood that is closer to the membrane. It's receiving the full force of the membrane, of the myocardium in this example. But the blood that is concentrated in the middle of the circle, it's harder to push. So there's a certain functional relationship between the diameter of the heart and the ability to influence the blood in the middle. And when you get to a ratio where your ventricle is so big, you lose the ability to affect blood in the middle. When you lose that ability, stroke volume goes down, ejection fraction goes down, and it can be clinical. It can be to a place where you are ineffective and inefficient. This can happen due to disease, hypertrophy of the left ventricle that accompanies cardiac diseases, but can also help occur due to aerobic exercise. So once in a while you hear about people that have left ventricle hypertrophy. They are healthy, they work out a lot, but they still result in cardiac arrest and sometimes death because their heart has become so big, the ventricle has become so big, not thick, big, there's a difference, that they're not able to sustain a ratio between the force that is produced by the heart when it contracts and the distance to the middle, meaning that you cannot push blood effectively. So keep that in mind. So we don't want the heart to become to lose its elasticity and elevate its plasticity. Smoking does that. Ischemia does that. Other drugs can cause that. So that's a major principle in disease and health. Afterload and preload. So let's start with afterload. Afterload is basically a measure of the resistance that the heart has to work against in order to achieve a certain stroke volume. That means that the resistance from the systematic circulation is the major influencer of stroke volume when you look at afterload. That can be the diameter of the aorta and the overall resistance of the system, which is represented by systolic blood pressure. Let's talk about that for a second, and it's in the presentation. When you say that someone has blood pressure of 120 over 80, what are you saying? What does that number mean? What does the 120 mean? What does the 80 mean? Besides saying that this one is systolic and this one is diastolic, it is those values represent the amount of work, the amount of resistance that the left ventricle has to overcome in order to produce stroke volume. The higher the numbers, the more workload your left ventricle is working against, and the higher the wear and tear of the heart is going to be. So we want two things to happen, and in one condition. We want the numbers, the values, to be as low as possible, and we want the difference between the two to be as low as possible if function is normal and if it's not from a disease. Now those are two big ifs, and I'm aware of it. Let me explain. If the resistance outside of the heart is producing a pressure of 120 millimeters of mercury, Hg, you have to produce a bigger pressure, a higher pressure within the heart in order for the valve to open and the pressure from the inner side to overcome the pressure from the outside. So that would be 121 at least. So when you say that someone has 80 over 120, you're saying that that is the average blood pressure in humans. I want you to remember that the average person is not fit. So that's not the best you can ask for. But it also has not been correlated to diseases, meaning that 120 over 80, 80 over 120, it doesn't matter, in my opinion, where you write the numbers, as long as you know which one is which, is an indication of are you sick or not, and 120 over 80 is not good, it's simply not bad. It's non-pathological, it's usually not related to diseases, and there is a difference. If you can have 100 over 60, even better. Alright? The difference between the two is the extent of work that the heart has to do, to go through, to work, to accomplish, between systolic and diastolic. The higher the number, the worse. So it's like the amount of money you would have to pay in order to produce a stroke volume, only that you're paying in pressure and not in real money. So that's about afterload. Obviously, afterload also depends on the resistance that the system is producing to the idea of injecting fluids into it, and we'll talk about resistance in a few minutes. When the aortic pressure is extremely high, the resistance, the immediate resistance to the ventricle is high, and that leads to hypertension. Hypertension is a force that you have to overcome. It is mechanical resistance to the work of the heart. We talked about the idea of mechanical stimulation versus chemical stimulations, if you remember. And the higher the mechanical stimulation, the higher the mechanical adaptation is going to be. So that leads to left ventricular hypertrophy. When it does not come from exercise, and even sometimes when it comes from exercise, it's not a good sign. It means that your heart is working way harder than it should in order to produce stroke volume of a certain extent. So left ventricular hypertrophy accompanied with hypertension are bad signs of increased systematic resistance and of a problem in the system when it is not due to aerobic exercise. Alright, let's see. So the brain has centers that regulate and supervise important processes, and obviously blood flow, blood pressure, heart rate, stroke volume, resistance of the system, the amount of oxygen, perfusion, are all major processes and values that the brain wants to regulate and supervise. The brain always receives information from two different kinds. One is mechanical and the other is chemical. Always. It's not this one or the other. So it has receptors spread out in strategic points, majorly around the heart, on the heart, around the lungs, on the lungs, and throughout vessels. It uses mechanical tension or stress to indicate the volumes that are produced or pumped through the vessels, and it has chemical receptors called chemoreceptors that can indicate the level of oxygen, CO2, and hydrogen with a clear preference to oxygen. The mechanical receptors are called either baroreceptors or pressoreceptors accordingly. They feed information directly to the cardiovascular center in the brain and the cardiorespiratory system in the brain. And the way that things work are that if we're talking about blood flow, about volumes, the tension or distension of a vessel or of an organ such as the heart, the aorta for instance, has to meet a certain standard. If it is below that standard, then both chemical and neurological influences cause. It can also be, when I'm saying chemical, just to make sure, can be talking about hormones, are secreted and influence blood pressure. Blood pressure goes up by constricting, the vessel, so vasoconstriction. When blood pressure goes up, blood flow goes up, and oxygen perfusion to the tissues goes up, and vice versa. In order to influence blood pressure and blood flow, velocity, pressure, you have to control fluids. Viscosity, by the way, that we've talked about, you have to control fluids. And this is where the renal system becomes a major influencer of function and metabolism. It has a huge influence, and the renal system governs the idea of fluid retention or excretion. If you want to elevate blood pressure, in addition to vasoconstriction, you have to retain fluids, meaning losing less fluids by the kidneys and through urine. So obviously changes in urine are indicators of the state of the fluids of the body, dehydration versus rehydration or hydration in general, and the ability to retain fluids. The higher the volume of fluids in the blood, the higher the blood pressure would be, the higher blood flow will be, and the higher oxygen perfusion, if there's no problems with the respiratory system, is going to be. Obviously, blood flow depends, as we have said, on resistance, but we want to divide the cardiac system, cardiac vascular system, into two major theoretical systems. The first one is called the central system, that includes the heart itself, and the major arteries and veins leaving it in the closest proximity to it, and the peripheral system, that theoretically is everything from the heart outwards. Obviously, the end point are the capillaries that reach tissues and cells. Resistance depends on blood flow. The higher the blood flow, the higher the resistance. The more pressure that is put upon a tissue or upon a vessel in this case, the more resistance it's going to induce. Resistance itself depends on the length and the diameter of the vessel. So a bigger diameter and a longer length change resistance. Length meaning that there is more time to resist flow. So the longer the vessel, the higher the resistance. Bigger vessels tend to resist less to blood flow, and allow faster velocity of blood. So the average velocity of blood flow in a bigger vessel is higher than in a smaller vessel. That also will depend on compliance. The tendency of a vessel to allow high volumes of fluid to enter. So the highest compliance is in veins. And in the arteries, we see different levels of compliance according to the muscle fibers of the vessel, and the amount of muscle fibers and elasticity within the arteries. Resistance also depends in a way on the type of blood flow. So we have linear blood flow and we have turbulent blood flow. Basically, in normal conditions, the blood flow should be linear. It means that according to the distance from the membrane of the vessel, blood flows in different velocities, always in straight lines, always straight ahead. And the more you go to the middle of the vessel, the faster the blood flow is. The closer you get to the membrane, flow can even stop at times, if not just be dragged or extremely slow. When flow becomes turbulent, that is not recommended, not wanted. You're wasting a lot of energy. Blood arrives at its destination slower. Substances may be broken down or split due to collisions with the membrane and other molecules. So it's basically a mess, and it's very inefficient, and that can happen due to a few reasons. The major reason would be obstruction of the vessel, such in arteriosclerosis, any kind of deposits in the blood vessel. We tend to think about fat, but it can also be thrombosis, anything that will obstruct the normal flow of blood may turn the flow to turbulent, and that's not wanted. When we're talking about blood flow can be calculated as the pressure divided by the resistance of the vessel. So higher pressure, as we have said, increases blood flow. Higher resistance lowers them. The optimal situation is high pressure, low resistance, right? But that's when we look at a single vessel. Let's talk about the resistance of a system. So when we're talking about the resistance of a system, we're talking about total resistance or total peripheral resistance, which takes into consideration two major components. One is the total cross-sectional area, meaning the sums of the diameters of the vessels in the system that you want to look at its resistance. So if you have one aorta that is split at the end to, just for an example, I'm making this up, 1,000 capillaries, then you had to add up the sum of all the vessels and the diameters of all the vessels from the aorta down to the last capillary. The second thing is, how are these vessels arranged? Are they arranged in series or parallel? When vessels are arranged in series, that tends to lessen the resistance to flow, and when they are arranged in parallel, it tends to increase the resistance to flow. Velocity. The more pressure you have, the faster blood flows, but the downside, the disadvantage of high velocity is that you have less time to extract nutrients and substances from the blood. Imagine that something is passing in front of you and you need to grab it. So here we go, it's going slowly, it's easier to grab, right? But if it's going fast, it's harder to grab. So imagine that you want to grab something, you want to extract something from the plasma. The faster plasma is flowing, the harder it is to extract something from the blood. So but on the other hand, the faster you get supplied with what you need. So there's a balance here between velocity and the ability to extract whatever you need from the blood. Alright, we've talked about compliance. Let's talk about the pulse pressure once more. We've kind of talked about, but we didn't call it that. So pulse pressure is the difference between systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure, and that is actually the indication to how much work the heart has to work to produce in order to produce one stroke volume, right? And it's an indication of the workload on the heart. We want pulse pressure to be as low as possible. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about two more issues, major issues, one being auto-regulation, and then we'll address the lymphatic system. Auto-regulation is the ability of a vessel to auto-regulate by itself, obviously, blood pressure. And by regulating blood pressure, you should know that we are regulating blood flow and tissue perfusion, and so on and so forth. The exact mechanism of how vessels are able to auto-regulate blood flow is not known, but we have indicated two theories in the presentation and in the book. The first one is the myogenic theory. According to the myogenic theory, smooth muscles of the vessels react to arterial perfusion pressure, causing constriction of the vessels, elevating resistance, but also elevating blood flow. Once again, in the myogenic theory, everything starts from smooth muscles that respond to arterial perfusion pressure, causing vasoconstriction and elevation of blood flow, but also resistance. In the metabolic theory, everything starts from the myocardium, from the heart itself, that reacts to the level of oxygen in the blood. If the level of oxygen is decreased, adenosine is secreted, causing vasodilation, causing resistance to flow to go down, but blood flow to go up. What is the truth? Obviously, you have three options, either one of them or both at the same time. About the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is a drainage system that filters fluids that it receives from the vascular system. It filters it against infections, inflammatory factors, and proteins. If proteins are too big to go back, they will be drained by the lymphatic system, and the lymphatic system usually accepts, so to speak, fluids that cannot be contained due to pressure and volume in that same area of the vascular system. The lymphatic system drains into the thorax area close to the heart. So basically, the vessels, the lymphatic vessels, run alongside the blood vessels of either kind, arteries or veins, and accumulate volumes of fluids and drain back and give it back to the system at a certain point. The help that the lymphatic system gives is that it allows to balance pressure in the blood vessels. Otherwise, blood vessels would be of increased volume and might actually explode. Of course, that would also influence tonicity and concentration of certain substances, and that's not a good idea. The lymphatic system is one directional. You cannot go back until you drain through a node of one of the systems. What else? One of the ways that the fluids of the lymphatic system, called the lymph, is pushed forward is through the help of the surroundings. So that would be the contraction of skeletal muscles and other tissues that surround the vessels. That's all for this week. I hope you have a great week and learn well for the quiz on Thursday. Have a good one. Goodbye.